Welcome back to another update. It is your Sweep Union. In this one, the Russians made 4 separate advances. They managed to advance within Siversk, capturing the majority of the town, including the eastern parts of the railway line and much of the eastern flank of the river line going through the western parts of the town. The Russians also managed to advance to the south of Mirnorod and to the west of the city, gaining control over Svitle. The Russians also managed to advance in the northern parts of Rodinska. Google Maps updated the fortifications just west of the Chess Yar, giving an insight to what exactly I have mapped out on the map with the fortifications. And there's also been a destruction of a dam here to the northwest of Bakhmut, which the Ukrainians did to slow down the Russian advances near Vesyokivka further northeast. And the Russians destroyed several crossings across the Siversk river line here to the east of Kharkiv as they continue their own offensive operations alongside the river line. Starting out in the Mirnorod direction, the Russians continued advances north of the apartment complex area, where they're working on connecting their forces between the apartment complex area in the northeastern parts with the apartment complex area in the southern parts. This is to push through towards the central apartment complex buildings and into the central parts of the city. At the same time, they managed to gain control over Svitle here on the western flank of Mirnorod, pushing through the western streets and gaining full control over the town, to then enter into the western parts of Mirnorod. They already had a connection through the railway line and the 2504 highway. They are now also connected further northwest near Svitle, and they push through the railway line. With this, the Russians have reached the city from the western parts entirely, and this will speed up the Russian capture of the city as they are now attacking it from every single possible direction, except from through the open fields to the southwest, which really makes no sense because they can move through areas with a lot more cover. So with this, the Russians are almost with full control over the city, leaving just short of 8 square kilometers remaining under Ukrainian control. However, this does not mean the Battle of Mirnorod is ending anytime soon, as the Ukrainians still have a significant presence within it, several apartment complexes and industrial areas to operate within. To the north of this, the Russians managed to gain control of additional residential buildings within Rodinska here in the northern flank, where the Ukrainians barely have a foothold remaining within the city. Russians are slowly pushing through to gain full control over the city, and the Ukrainians are refusing to withdraw from it and are instead attempting to counterattack and regain and strengthen their foothold within the city. As the battle goes back and forth, the Russians are looking to gain full control of it, and with the connection with Pokrovsk further south, the Russians are able to properly strengthen their offensive operations. They are moving slowly and securely to gain full control over the city, but the Ukrainians are putting a lot of pressure on them as well. To the northeast of this, in the northeastern flank of Kashantinivka, an interesting update by Google Maps along these fortifications. We're taking a look at them. The map has been updated and now includes the satellite imagery of these trenches from around when they were built. And we know that from the fact that some of these fortifications that we see to the northwest of Yar, if we zoom in on the trenches here, we can see that there is a lumber right next to it. This is flooring through the trenches for when the rain comes falling down. The trench itself does not become muddy and does not limit the movement of Ukrainian soldiers within these trenches. So the Ukrainians were still building these trenches when the satellite imagery was taken. We also see to the east of it, there are these different piles of dragon teeth located on the eastern flank of them, leading all the way up to the residential areas. Goes down south and then on the eastern flank. However, the Ukrainians never managed to properly build these anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth lines here on the western flank of Yar because the front line moved closer and closer towards them, limiting their work. This is why the build was continued further south, but never along the western flank of Yar and was not mapped out. There is a gap in the fortifications that is located here to the northwest of Maiske, and this allowed the Russians to advance in this section of the front line, while further south the movement has been very limited. But again, this raises the question, why has the satellite imagery been updated to present these fortifications? We see how it cuts directly here along the western flank of Yar. So the southern part here has not been updated, But just northwest of it in the southern flank of Chervona, this has been updated. Why is this the case? Who does it benefit and so on? We'll have to figure that out. It's cut off right here as well, so it's a small portion here. Maybe an attempt by the Russians to push through from the south and from the north along the flanks to bypass fortifications further east. As already control Marinka in the north and Predichin in the south, it could have been attempted there. There's also some updates here along the fortifications within the city, where the Russians are already present within, covering the southern flank for such operations. So a push by the Russians from the south and from the north is certainly possible, and the updated imagery could help the Ukrainians to detect any weaknesses in the Russian positions alongside these positions. So again, I'm not really sure exactly why this small portion of the front has been updated, but it's very interesting that it has. It has happened before. To the southwest of Minrat, these fortifications were also updated along the satellite imagery, especially here to the south, where the trenches here has been revealed. This was also during the battles over them. As the Russians were fighting on the western flank along the city of Pokrovsk itself, they were pushing through along the railway lines to gain control over it and cut off the supplies to the Ukrainian forces operating near Novopavlivka, Sohyar, Lysivka, and so on, along the fortifications there as well. The revelation of these trenches and fortifications allowed the Ukrainians to map out a withdrawal route for their forces as the Russians were working on the flanks. It has also happened in the Kharkiv region, where the Ukrainians' trenches here located alongside the eastern bank of the Uska River line were revealed suddenly with no warning. And again, these are areas where the Ukrainians were located, if I were to map it out. Something like this, where they were present along the fortifications here, and the Russians were in the direction of Zaharizove to the southwest and the Lusova in the southeast. Again, an area where the Russians were pincering the Ukrainian forces and were looking to outflank the Ukrainians and cut them off. So again, these are areas where the Russians were threatening an encirclement of the Ukrainians. Then the Google Maps map was updated. Who exactly benefits, whether it is secretly helping the Russians or it is a help for the Ukrainians, that is the general staff that knows that. That is the soldiers on the front line that knows that. Unfortunately, I have no idea. It could also simply be that the Russians have captured these areas and the Google Maps just updates archive pictures that they've had for years. In the Siversk direction, the Russians managed to gain control over the eastern parts. Following the capture of the apartment complex area, the Ukrainians did not have any proper stronghold on the eastern parts of the railway line. The Russians made a push from the south along the southern entryway along the railways up towards Siversk, gaining control over much of the eastern bank of the Bakhmutovka River, combined with a push from the Russian forces from the eastern flank and from the northern flank to connect the forces all around Siversk into the central parts towards the Bakhmutovka River. The Russians are working on pushing into the western parts of the Bakhmutovka River, and this is the furthest the Russians have advanced within Siversk since the start of the war. They had previously contested it back before I even started YouTube, but they were kicked out of it all the way back to the Luhansk region, and now they are contesting it again and have advanced even further than what they had previously. With this, the Russians continue offensive operations, gain control of the fortifications in the western flank of Siversk, the town itself, and consolidate their positions. As for the operations further south along the Vysokyivka, the Ukrainians blew a dam that was located around Previlya. This is a dam that is connected with the river line that goes through Bondarne and onwards towards Vysokyivka. As you see with this imagery here from Deep State Map, the blue outline is exactly the movement of the river line that is now going to be overflooding due to the blowing of the dam, which limits and slows down the Russian advance beyond Vysokyivka. As we've seen, the Russians had recently captured the town and pushed in the direction of Pazeno. With this, the river line has been expanded and limiting the Russian movement between Vysokyivka and Pazeno. This might be linked to a Ukrainian counterattack towards the town, or simply slowing down the Russian advances further beyond in the direction of Bondarne, Romivka, and Nikolivka further northwest. As for the Russians, they did a similar move, not blowing a dam, but the crossings across the Siversk-Donetsk River. There is this wider part of it along the border between the Kharkiv and the Belgorod region. If we take a look at it, there are three main crossings. There's one near Rodinska further north, then the one near in the central part, and then there's the dam crossing further south. All three of these have been blown over the past few days. They've been blown several times throughout this conflict, but a renewed blown of all three bridges simultaneously as the Russians are advancing along Liman and along the forest patch area further along the river line. This indicates the Russians will be strengthening defensive operations in the area, combined with the fact that the Ukrainians are counterattacking near Kupiansk. The roads here further south along Kharkiv will be congested here along the western flank near Shevchenko and Volokhiv Yar. That means the Russians can concentrate their fire with their long-range drones in that direction. Long-range strikes will be targeting that area more than any other areas, as most of the Ukrainian supplies will be going through that area now, especially going towards Kupiansk, but also everywhere along the eastern bank of the Siversk and his river line further north. And this will increase the effectiveness of the Russian deep strikes on the logistics of the Ukrainians, but it will also limit the Ukrainian offensive capabilities near Kupiansk and defensive capabilities near Vovchansk, and significantly improve the offensive capabilities of the Russians in both of these areas. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.